CAC members online and everybody else is in the room. Welcome, Jamie. And so Transit Working Group members, as you all recall, are the 9 jurisdictions plus the 6 invited guests from the CAC. So with that, let's jump right in. I understand we have a hard stop at 10:30. We may lose our quorum, so hopefully we can dive in, and we'll try to be brief on updating some of the members if they weren't here at the previous meeting. So moving on to item 2, and we can hopefully get a quick brief from Paki first, and then I'll make a couple updates as well, and then we can dive in. Hopefully roll up your sleeves and let's dive into the spreadsheet again. So go ahead, Paki.
Okay, thank you, Farhad. Good morning, everyone. So just a quick RTA Next update. There was a board meeting last Thursday on May 25th, and just some highlights from that board meeting, and anyone else can chime in if there's additional information. But the board did affirm, there was a couple action items. One was about the routine maintenance, and the board did affirm that the routine maintenance is not statutorily eligible for RTA funding. They did, however, say that capital maintenance may be considered. Also, the board also appointed Mr. Carmine DeBonis as a second TMC liaison to CAC. So welcome to Carmine. And then they had some discussion about the July 1st, 2023 deadline, but they said to continue to move forward with that deadline in mind.
Paki?
Yes.
So I just, that legal, the legal basis behind RTA not being able to do our funding going towards routine maintenance is provided here. Is that what this is?
Yes.
I do see that. It says that you are empowered to undertake maintenance, but you don't own the road. So we can just turn our roads over to you and.
Well, that's not on the agenda. That's for a different discussion.
Oh, okay. I got something there.
Beautiful try. Nice,
Yeah.
nice attempt.
So thank you for asking that question. We've been having this discussion with the board since 2006. There's been ongoing discussions on who's responsible for maintenance. And so the legal opinion was really intended to give some guidelines and a framework for what is possible. And I think the focus was what is possible, and the takeaway based on the action of the board, what is possible is reconstruction of a roadway that is in a poor condition. So just keep that in mind. That's the takeaway.
Thank you. I just want to bring a little
humor.
Yeah, no, and thanks, Shane. That memo that's in front of you will be for separate discussion. In terms of the roadway element, there was some discussion about named projects, and we just wanted to reaffirm that the RTA statutes require identification of a corridor and the needs of the corridor. That's something you'll be discussing today. Projects with an identified corridor must be listed on the ballot as a named project. Scope and budget revisions may be made to the named projects to balance the budget. As you discussed a little bit last time. And funds can also be transferred to named projects from the categorical elements. For example, intersection improvements, but this is to keep named projects in count. And then another reminder is the scope of the named projects can vary. So there are some examples from the current RTA approved that include not all of the named projects are widening improvement projects. Some projects are traffic interchanges, such as the Ina Road TI. Some projects are new roads, like the Wilmot Road project. And then on the current RTA, number 23, Valencia Road is a safety intersection access management project. And then number 22 on the ballot of Irvington Road is intersection access management with bike lanes and sidewalks. These are just some examples of named projects with scopes that can vary. So that's just a brief update on what's going on.
Thank you. If you don't mind, go back to that slide again. So that's important because I've had questions since the last meeting as well. I really hope that we don't get bogged down on the mechanics of it. But our understanding is that if you're gonna name a specific project, just call it a named project, but your scope can be anything. Your budget can match your scope. So just keep that in mind. I don't want to continue to have that kind of a confusion. We've had that conversation with the CAC officers as well, and they understand that whatever we call a named project with a corridor and the limit, that's the named project. So unfortunately, Tom can't be here with us today, but we had this conversation with the CAC officers, and they're in agreement as well.
Hey, Farhad, I am here.
Good.
At least for a few minutes. I have a bunch of stuff going on, and so I'll be in and out of the meeting.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us. So, yes,
I have a question, but I didn't know whether, do we need anything more from, I want to give Tom a chance if he has to jump off, if there's anything. to
Oh,
share before I spoke. I don't
of
know.
course, I was gonna dive into the spreadsheet. Please, Tom, anything you wanted? Well, unfortunately, we did not have a CAC meeting. Yesterday, we didn't have a quorum, so there wasn't much more to report on. But Tom, anything you want to add?
No, listen, I apologize for not turning my camera on, but I have an unstable internet, it appears right now. So I think I'll just err on the side of safety. I think the direction that we started to go last time in this working group was really good. And I think it meshes with some of the thinking going on at the CAC with regard to helping identify these projects by type. So these, like the modernization projects, can I think rightly be described, although maybe not elegantly, as a combination of capital maintenance and safety, both ped and intersection type safety, and bikes, of course, you know, and even some transit, in that some of the projects really are enhancing the key routes. I forgot what the term is that is being used currently by RTA and Suntran for their key routes, but many of these modernization projects are on those types of routes. So that, together with bus pullouts and others, there's a nexus, I think, for virtually all of the categorical elements. And so looking at this more holistically, I think, as this group started to do last time, and I hear those sorts of conversations from the CAC as well, I think are a good direction.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Yes.
And then I just had two
Of course.
comments, sort of thinking about things since the last meeting. The first one, I think, is bouncing off what Tom just said, that I look at the slide, for example, and it's RTA next roadway element, but then we're calling them named projects. And just for me, I would like to take a moment and sort of look at the nomenclature that I think that the importance of naming projects is critical in all the elements, that I think the less ambiguity we have given to the voters in any of the areas is going to be critical.
Sure.
But that what I've heard over the last couple of meetings is when you look at a project, elements of each project could go different places, right? So but historically, when people are saying named projects, I think they think of just the roadways, and we want to name others. I don't know if it makes sense at any point to sort of get rid of calling them named projects, and then talk about, assume that all of our projects are going to be named and have a bucket that is corridor or roadway or whatever. And that, and then everything should be named, hopefully in the final analysis.
Yeah.
And then if
No, go ahead.
let me just, I'm gonna put out my second one to
Yep.
just.
Yeah.
And I think I'm looking at Rod, perhaps for a little bit more of this, that I've gotten myself a little confused about what's in RTA Next and what's regional money and what's additional state money. And that if we look, for example, of how much ADOT might be bringing into a project, and forgive me, it is for being the new one on this, are those, is the ADOT component part of this regional bucket that we are moving around in different places, or if ADOT's making an allocation or a match for any of the projects, is that coming in from state funding in some way in new dollar? Does that make sense?
I'll come back and answer your second question. Terry, what did you want to comment on the first question?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on what Jan said, the initial point that she made. And I think what you're hitting on, Jan, is exactly what we talked about a number of times. And we actually talked to the RTA board about it last week. The more named projects, and I'm with you, I get confused about named projects versus corridor projects versus safety projects versus intersection projects versus, whatever else. So I do like that. I actually like that idea of doing corridor projects that are named, and then the other bucket projects and where some of those other elements might fall into the buckets. So I would support that. I actually like that.
So that did come up at the board meeting and we discussed that. And that's one of the reasons I said earlier, let's just make a list and then come back. And then as Tom mentioned as well, then you group them later once you have a list. So I think that might be more productive. These are the things you want to name and then group them later once you know what group they fall into. And that was
So put them into categories after we have.
after you have your list,
have our
after
list.
you have your list. And I think that was Tom's suggestion as well, that yes, let's group them, but let's not get bogged down on the grouping up front. Let's have the list first.
So, but we can stop talking about named projects.
Yes. What would you like to call
That's not good.
it? So for the sake of having something, these are corridor projects that are going on a list.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll stick with that. Thank you. So your second question, going back to regional funds allocated for only ADOT projects. Those are regional funds. They come to the region. They're at the discretion of the regional council. ADOT obviously is a partner in that process. They identify future needs, but PAG through the regional long-range planning exercise identifies the revenue, identifies the expenses, and we have to be fiscally constrained. As we stand, based on the memo I sent out a couple months ago, we are fiscally constrained. If we make any changes to that assumption, then we got to go back and address fiscal constraint on the PAG side of the business.
I got that. I just, forgive me, Robert, I think at some point I've heard, well, ADOT will do 50% or ADOT would do X% of a project. And I just want to be clear that that's not additional dollars necessarily. That's not, there's no value assigned to the statement other than making sure I have clarity. That you're looking to kind of redivide ADOT dollars that are coming into the region rather than providing an additional.
Yes, so a couple of points. Number one, I want to point out that the funding that Farhad mentioned is federal funds. It just comes through the state, but it's federal funds. We have to follow federal process. In terms of what ADOT's put forward, we put forward projects that we think are vital to the region, and we set a percentage on that based on less impact, what we thought might be less impacted projects down the road that are in the RMAP. Because we have a goal that we put projects forward in the RMAP, and since that is a fiscally constrained document, we wanted to hold that. Some of the projects that were put in are outside of the RMAP. So at some point, there's going to have to be give somewhere. If we put in more projects that are in the RMAP, something's going to have to slip out because it's always has to remain fiscally constrained. So the challenge in my mind is going to be that we're not going to be looking at that evaluation of the RMAP until 25. So now we're looking at RMAP with various different estimate values in it and trying to come up with a method to see if it's fiscally constrained, and it's really hard to do that.
So just to add to that, the analysis we did and the split that was suggested tried to mitigate for that impact. So there was only a $5 million impact, But anything different, then we have to go back and mitigate for that impact and remove ADOT projects from the RMAC. So what the split that was in this document has no impact. Essentially, 5 million is manageable.
I appreciate your patience. We're sort of aware.
Of
We spend a lot of time talking about the buckets and I want to know what can go where and how we identify it and how much money is actually available. And
Of course,
ensure
of
that
course.
there's clarity.
Thank you for that. So again, the spreadsheet you have in front of you is what this working group adopted several meetings ago. That's just for reference. What we're gonna pull up is what the group discussed at the last meeting. That's the spreadsheet that we hope that's a draft working spreadsheet that we can make adjustments as we go down the list. So if you don't mind, pull up that spreadsheet. I'll walk through it just so everybody understands that what we're hoping to accomplish is to go back to what I believe was the request from this group, to have a ranking order process that regardless of future needs to make adjustments, you can come back to the same system. You have a consistent system. And I believe that comment was made by multiple members. So we want to make sure this is consistent with what we heard you say. So the spreadsheet, which I'm having a hard time saying, but hopefully most of you do. If you don't mind, go ahead and zoom in a little bit. We don't need the information on the right just now. There you go. All right, so what we have here, again, consistent with the exercise with the working group's request, you have the 4 different categories. You have the priority ranking that was submitted by individual jurisdictions. And then you also have the one project that was removed. So that's the only project that's been removed from this spreadsheet for now. And then as you go down the spreadsheet, you have the total target, which was the 1.1 billion. Based on the action of this working group, the projects that ranked all the way up to number 8, they are all fully funded in this scenario. Anything that ranked 9 and above, again, based on the action of this committee, will not be within that budget. And then the bottom line, you are very close to the 1.12 that was established by the board, but then there was a minor adjustment needed to make that budget whole. So any adjustments needed based on what we discussed before, those can come from those buckets. So at this point, and I can't see that number, what is the total there? The 1 point. Yeah. No, actually, that's spreadsheet. I'm sorry. 1.43. So we're at 1, right? Is that correct? 1.45.
That's different than this.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So again, this is the working spreadsheet. So this is the one I want to modify, and if you want to do any changes to. So we are currently at 1.4 based on most recent discussions at the last meeting's discussion. And the only way to accomplish that is to move funds from other buckets to do that. Any questions or comments?
I'm just trying to figure out, so I've got the packet up and
So the
roadway corridor project list is 1.488 and that's 1.454. So I just don't know where the difference
So
is.
we moved funds from the buckets to accommodate
On this sheet.
on this sheet. This is a working sheet. So we can work off this if you like,
No, I just want to make sure. I
but
understand.
we're recommending to work off this. So this is a live document to make changes. But if you like, we can work off the hard copy you have. The only difference here is that we're trying to offer a solution that move funds from categories to make projects whole. That's the only difference.
So that's the correct document that none of us can see.
Well, zoom in more, zoom in more. That's a working document. So again, if, and then there's a notation on the bottom that says you can hit the 0 target But you can only do that obviously by going 1.12.
So Farhad, for clarification, you've taken out everything that's below 8.
Yeah,
those-
according to this
those-
group's recommendation,
So
we're
the
able.
G column, we're balanced right now. Because you got your money tie on. It's nice and green there.
Correct. So again, last time this group made a recommendation was, let's accomplish as many as we can. And how can we do that? We're saying you can do that with anything that's ranked all the way up to number 8. And to do that, you're only moving roughly about $30 million from the buckets to accomplish that.
So Farhad, I just want to, it'll help me to understand where we're at in order for me to be able to move forward. We had 2 meetings ago, we had one option and that was this ranked and, okay. And then, and based off of that, there was $75 million on the table, and that included the country club road being
Reduction.
taken off.
Correct.
So I don't see anything different here.
The only thing that's different on this working document is that the 75 is now assigned to number 9 project, plus another roughly $30 million from the buckets. So essentially you're adding one more project. That's the only difference.
Oh, on the modernization.
Number 9
Category?
project
Yeah,
is Speedway. So again, we're offering a perspective of how can you get one more project, at least in this case, and get to hopefully get to a place that now you have pretty much exceeded the 1.1, but only by roughly $30 million.
I also want to, thank you. I also want to acknowledge the work of this group at our most recent meeting where City of Tucson, Mike presented another thought process that dealt with SR 210
Yep.
and a consideration on 22nd Street.
Yep. So
How
that
do you propose-
scope change has been made in here as well. And in your packet, you have second spreadsheet in your packet. So that proposal is in there. And I think the question was, does that balance? Yes, it does balance.
Well,
That's where the other 20 million comes from.
Correct.
Okay.
well, I mean, moving SR 210 out.
This version does not.
Okay, that's what okay, so this version does not acknowledge what Tucson has brought to the table by way of consideration.
This version is consistent with the motion that this group made several meetings ago, left 75 on the table. All we're suggesting is that now if you use the 75 on one project plus some additional change, you can accomplish this balance. So you're correct. You have one with 75 on the table. You have one with a balanced budget, which is on the screen. And then you had the city's proposal, which is in your packet, that removes money from SR 210. Yes, right.
Didn't remove SR 210, it just reduced the RTA contribution.
Reduced funding, yes,
Want to clarify that.
yes.
Thank you. It's an important clarification
Yeah,
because
that's why I wanted to make-
the proposal is that that project stay as a priority for the region. It's just the proposal is that it get funded regional dollars instead of the
Which goes to the
RTA.
discussion we were having earlier about the pot only being so big. So it's got to be a balancing act, which is exactly what we're trying to accomplish.
So again, $125 million with the analysis we did, then we have to go back to the RMAP and remove projects from the dot list if that's the direction you want to go. With this scenario, you do not have to do that. And you also add another project. So the number 9 ranked project is added.
So is SR 210, we're still at our original funding or did we reduce
In
it
this scenario, yes.
in this scenario?
Yes,
Okay. Which keeps us balanced with the RMAP.
correct. So going back to the thought process, and that's, I think, what we heard you say was that you want to have a ranking order to be able to make adjustments in the future. So with this scenario, you have that ranking order. You can come back and make adjustments as needed if we need to make any further adjustments in the future. So I thought that's what you all asked for, so that's why we're providing this spreadsheet. If that's not what you asked for, then obviously we can move on to the spreadsheet you have in front of you.
Hey, Farhad.
Yes.
Yeah,
Go
just to kind of conclude that thought there. So we're at a point where perhaps we can also consider digging deeper into those unnamed projects out of, I'm sorry, to dig into the categorical elements to fund even more of those named projects as a possibility.
Correct. So this is the step in that direction. And with this scenario, only $38 million was used from those buckets. Terry, did you want to add something?
No.
So one thing that can be helpful, I think, is to look at what those individual categorical sub elements are. So each element, like safety, has 4 or 5 sub elements, and some of them are appropriate, some perhaps not so appropriate for naming a project and using that funding for it. And I'm assuming, because you didn't, I don't see it reflected on. I see you took out 4.5 million out of the active transportation, but left the rest of the buckets intact. Is that right?
That looks, if you don't mind zooming a little bit more, so this is the highlighted yellow section down there.
Farhad, can somebody email this spreadsheet out right now?
Sure.
I can look at it.
So, correct, you're looking at $90 million versus 85, is it? Yep. So that's
Yeah,
the
85.5. Okay.
that's the only change. All the other elements are the same as before.
Yeah, so as an example, just look at the administrative just as an example. It has the 100, which essentially is not touchable, it seems. The 10, which likely would be largely spent on these, if you will, city-centric or inner-city projects, since those are the built-out areas where the most impact on businesses is likely to occur. So that Main Street process, which is the extra 10 million in administrative, could be an appropriate location to take some of that money if you're trying to fund more of those named projects. Same thing with safety. When you talk about intersection safety, a number of these projects are really about upgrading signals and intersection safety elements. And I guess that's also kind of the areas where I would say, if you wanted to name some projects utilizing that funding source, it would be pretty appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's what was the discussion earlier. If you have corridor projects and want to include more corridor projects, you need to remove it from these buckets.
Yeah.
Yes, Paul.
Just a thought, I don't want to upset the apple cart here, being we haven't been at this committee for a while. What if one of two things happens? One, we keep looking at the buckets we look at named projects, and then we look at the other buckets. What if we weren't buckets? We solidify a list of named projects. There's going to be a residual amount of money left over, and that can be split amongst those things. But we really, the two key elements are going to be the named corridor projects and mass transit. Those are the two main elements of the RTA. We have the safety, which can be picked up by PAG, 12.6 funding. Can we solidify, because we're running out of time here, can we solidify the list? It looks like we're almost there, and adjust the buckets or eliminate the buckets to make the entire list whole within the constraints of the revenue that we expect.
I believe that's the conversation for today, that how many things you want to actually identify as a corridor project, which is what was discussed earlier. So yeah, you're on the same track.
Chair, I'd be interested in engaging the group in a conversation with a bit of a hybrid to what we're seeing here. And that would be, the city introduced an idea of moving the SR 210 project into the regional bucket. If the region got behind that idea, in other words, identifying that as, and that messes with the RMAP, right? Okay, I get it. But if it's a regionally prioritized project and we all get behind it, understanding the importance of modernization projects for the city, could we then take that capacity in the corridor projects and actually move it into the modernization category of corridor projects to fund even more on that list as named projects in corridor?
Sure.
And I wonder how far that gets down that list of prioritized projects. Is that moving us in the right direction as a region? Is it that backwards? I don't know, but I'm interested in entertaining the discussion.
So again, the only policy discussion is the impact to the RMAP and the impact to the ADOT project list. So that would,
RMAP specify projects, or is it?
yes, there's a list of projects that are fully funded and within the financial constraint of the RMAP. And that was the exercise to make sure that anything RTA 2 proposes does not impact the RMAP list of projects.
Always updated.
It's updated every 4 years, and yes, as we
Only
discussed.
updated every 4 years. There's no amendment.
Well, we can make amendments, obviously, but that is a significant change. I would consider that as part of the update.
Well, it's been a really,
Farhad?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, Tom.
Yeah, just riffing on Shane's thought there, that I actually penciled out some thoughts about that with the assumption that we wanted to fund all 16 of the projects. What would the impact be on the remnant pot of categorical money? And essentially it was like, you got to take about 36% of
64
the of all the categorical in order to pay for all the rest of those named modernization projects. And that gets pretty deep, I think, into transit. It takes half of the safety money and then has more like a third or less of some of the others. In any case, it's doable, but you're really going to, particularly with transit, I think you're going to have an issue getting enough money out of the buckets in order to go all the way to the bottom. But it is, at least in my mind, it looks like it's technically feasible.
Here. So I'm in alignment here with Tom, and I think to a large degree with Shane. Just kind of adding up the numbers remaining after the number 8 project there for the city of Tucson, and taking from 3669 down to 3672, which roughly 230 million. So I guess the question is, how far do we want to go into taking from the buckets to try and fund those? The other thing is, there are, and I guess we're all working with the same amount of money here, but there are also elements within other projects of other jurisdictions that fall into the buckets. And I don't know that we've really, and maybe now it's not the time to get into the weeds on that, but to identify the elements within some of these other projects that fall into the buckets, to see what money is left and available. And so what's been kind of printed out for us and suggested is that it goes all the way down to the Speedway project, which is a $96 million project. I don't know from the city of Tucson's perspective that is the highest priority one. It looks, based on the ranking, I believe it is. But if they can get more further buck going with some of the other projects.
Yeah, so I think Carolyn's online as well, but just to summarize what I think Tom said. So 36%, Tom, is roughly how much in dollar amounts?
About 290 million.
Okay, so again, just keep that in perspective. Currently, there's 790 within the buckets. So 290 out of the 790 from the buckets would accomplish what you mentioned. Go ahead, Carolyn.
I didn't have anything to say. Were you talking to me, Farhad?
Yeah, I thought they said you had your hand up. If you don't mind, we'll move on then. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, can I just ask a question
Sure.
real quick?
Go ahead.
So, Tom, you came up with 290 million. What is that based on? Because I added up projects 3669 through 3672 and came up with roughly 230 million.
Yeah, no, I was working off the old spreadsheet that had us with the extra 75 million and assumed that it would be utilized on 9 and 10.
Okay.
So then, so the numbers are going to be somewhat different, but in essence, taking a third of each of the buckets and kind of combining them, was able to zero out the named projects in the back of a napkin exercise that I did. But I think obviously we have better numbers here and can look at it a little more clearly.
I think it was Jan and Shane
So
and Jamie. Go ahead.
what about our $70 million high capacity transit project?
So that's part of the
What
same
happened?
discussion. So if you reduce the 790 now to 5, then now we have a budget constraint. I think that's clear. So now you got to make a decision. Where does that go?
Because I thought we were going to put that in transit, but now transit doesn't have enough money.
Well, if this proposal moves forward, yes, we're cutting 36%, but we're still having a discussion.
Still have it in there.
Go ahead.
I know the city did a lot of work, like kind of think rescoping their projects. Is that reflected in here, or is this document?
It is reflected in that document. This document was the prior action by this committee. It's not reflected in here.
So the city's work is on that.
It is in here, yes. With the scope changes and the cost estimate changes, that's in here as well. I think it was Terry, Shane, and Jeanette. No, not Terry, Shane.
Still mulling over. Go
I
ahead.
want to pass for
Yeah.
that. Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out to remind the group, and I think Mr. Rosemont sort of touched upon it, is that when the working group met back in September, and we had our big workshop, some of the jurisdictions removed projects with the understanding that categorical money could address some of those projects. So that was sort of the compromise that was made. So we need to keep that in mind as we look at this exercise and how, if we're gonna start pulling money out of categoricals, those, we're now looking at, are we gonna assign that categorical money just to these projects, or to keep in mind that there were other regional projects that were discussed as potential for categorical spending.
And to add to that, by what Tom was suggesting, we're really back to what Paul said, that we're basically only have enough money for current transit operations. There won't be any more money for any other categoricals if we go down that road. Go ahead. Yes, Jason.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to comment that the city reevaluated their projects and rescoped some of their projects. And I just wondering if there was, I think the county has several projects, the second highest number of projects on the list. Could they go through the same exercises that the city did and maybe rescope some of their projects and kind of bring the cost down in that regard?
We did, so we did that, and then the city did it, but we scoped a couple times, but let's see what we can do.
Yeah, and then just as a reminder, that's part of this ongoing exercise. I know there are other members that may make adjustments, change scope. Cost adjustments will be hopefully coming forward as well. So that's part of the whole process. And if anybody, again, I ask everybody, if you are looking at any scope changes, we'll handle that through our cost estimating exercise and make those scope and cost adjustments. So that'll come to us in the future. Yes, Paul.
So back on that point of the elimination of the buckets. If we can get regional funding back as active and available for jurisdictions, I know at least for Oro Valley, we'd be happy with that. That's $400 million over the next 20 years. I think 12.6 is what, 20 million a year?
Roughly, yes.
So that's 400 million over the next 20 years that would be out competitively for all the jurisdictions to do environmental, do safety. I know most of our projects that we pulled off the list, we went back in hindsight and said, well, that's not really regional. It's more a safety element that's critical in Oro Valley. We don't have the money to pay for these projects, but if we could certainly get PAG and 12.6 funding available for the region again, we'd be happy to compete with that, over the next 20 years. And that's what I'm thinking, environmental issues, safety issues, those things are things that can be dealt with at that PAG level. And again, that's $400 million, which is a large chunk when we're talking about the 2.3 billion.
Yes, Jamie.
So I understand your spreadsheet, right? Of the 500 million that the city of Tucson is requesting for modernization projects, all but 185 million of that is in this current proposal, and we're balanced.
Yes, if you don't mind, roll up a little bit.
If I look at that 185, right?
There,
So-
you see all the numbers in
Yeah.
red under column G.
So Shane, some of your ideas try to allocate some of that 185 in the categoricals.
That wasn't my idea.
Oh.
I agree with I agree with what was, sorry, your name,
Jeanette.
Jeanette, sorry, Jeanette. I agree with what Jeanette just said in that a lot of jurisdictions way back when, many moons ago, pulled projects off thinking that there was a chance to address some of those issues in the categoricals.
Categoricals later.
So there's a little sensitivity there. My suggestion in terms of wanting to have a dialogue around was if the region was comfortable with the idea of moving the SR 210 project out of the corridor named projects and into to compete with the regional RMAP projects, then that would take roughly $200 million and we could essentially fund the rest of these modernization projects. And we've identified a solution to get all of these prioritized corridor projects for the most part, with the exception of the SR 210 and the Country Club project funded. And that's a solution that we can move forward. And then we can jump into how do we assign the categoricals now, including the 70 million in capacity in those buckets, and try to name as many projects as we can, because we want to get across the finish line with the voters. And I think voters are going to appreciate knowing where those monies are going, instead of this, that hey, we want to be flexible and react in 15 years. So anyway, that's the thought that I had in terms of, let's have a conversation on that. Maybe it doesn't work, maybe it works, but yeah, that was it.
Go ahead, Brian.
Thank you, Chair. I just want a little clarification to what Mr. Dilly was saying. Is the suggestion that SR 210 forward, such as the city presented at our last meeting, or is the suggestion that SR 210 be completely pulled out of RTA next?
Sorry, I don't know if there's, what's the difference, Mike?
The city suggested at the last meeting that the funding RTA next be reduced from 50% funding of the project to 10% values of funding.
Okay.
But left it in RTA next.
Okay.
What I just heard you say was that it
Thank
would be pulled completely out of RTA next, which, if that's a reasonable decision, we have that discussion, but I'm not confident that that's what we said. So
No,
I
I
want
was,
to clarify that.
I was going off of what the city was recommending in terms of, I guess so 10% would stay in RTA next.
Correct, and there's a good logic to that. It prioritizes the project. It means that the project will move forward as part of RTA next money. The federal funds that are part of the region will have to then be allocated towards that project. So there's lots of reasons to leave that in there if it's vital. to the
Thanks for the clarification, Rod. I do appreciate that. I think even with that clarification, there would still be essentially enough money to handle the 185 million that's left over in modernization.
Actually, I think the SR 210 is 165 million.
Oh, I thought it was over 200, sorry.
To 50 million, that's
It would be,
not 185. It gets us close.
Chair, I do have another question.
Go
I
ahead.
want to kind of expand on what Mr. Dilly was saying, because I think when we start talking percentages and reductions to ADOT projects and dollar values, we have to look at 10, 15, 20 years down the road. When you look at a standalone project with a budget of, say, $50 million in this year, it's going to, that entire project cost will be inflated, and that entire cost will be part of RTA next, and the value will go on, so that the whole project is budget. I'm not confident that's the case when we do a percentage of the dollar values for projects. So for example, with SR 210, if we put in 30 million in 2025, and then also the same 30 million, which has significantly less value in 2045, or does that 30 million get increased along? In other words, is it a 10% value, or is it a $30 million value? 10% value becomes inflated over time. A $30 million value might not, because it's not a standalone project. So how are we managing those questions?
So as you recall, the cost estimating exercise will include inflation and offer a cost estimate based on when we believe the project is going to go to construction. So that's as close as you get for that exercise. So it'll be reflected in the cost. On the revenue side, the current revenue estimate is projected with future increases in the revenue, but then it's deflated back to 2022 for comparison purposes, apples to apples. So we got to make sure that both the revenue side as well as the cost are in 2022 dollars for that purpose. But yes, in the future, there is inflation both on the expenses as well as revenue.
And that applies to a partial participation rate.
Whatever that amount is, yes.
Because I wasn't confident that applied in the last RTA.
So the last so the last RTA, again, if you recall, we went through the recession, we ended up getting bids that were much lower. So there was really no inflation per se until recently. So that's why it didn't apply to any of the ADOT projects.
Thank you.
So again, pleasure of the group. Some obviously direction would be helpful for the CAC discussion. CAC is going to meet again and
We
it would be
hope.
helpful next Monday. So it would be helpful for them to kind of have a little bit of an understanding of which direction, at least this group would recommend to lean.
Farhad, what's staff's recommendation?
That recommendation is you have a system and that's a spreadsheet. So using the spreadsheet, you can always go back and work your way up as we have discussed all along. So if for some reason we end up and we need to add projects, go down the list, add projects. If you need to reduce projects, go up the list and reduce projects. I think that's the cleanest approach that you can justify. You can demonstrate that you meet everybody's priority up to number 9 priority for every single jurisdiction. And also, again, that kind of honors the ADOT's priority being SR 210 and not impacting our map. Impacting our map, in my opinion, that's a policy decision. I don't think that's something that we want to take lightly. Because we know it will impact other ADOT projects if you do that.
I do want to say that one of the projects we have on this list, on the ADOT list, is not an ADOT project, but it is in with ADOT right away. And it's on the contingency, I think it's the contingency level for RMAP. So there will be an effect to RMAP. Right now,
So that was included in our analysis, and that was a $5 million impact. So there was room to absorb that reserved project, and the impact was only $5 million, and that's manageable when we're dealing with a $15 billion budget.
I didn't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. So again, pleasure of the group. What recommendations we're going to make again, both Terry and Carmine have been actively participating with the CAC discussion, and they're having the same, I think, difficulty making a decision on, well, how do we want to approach it? So what do you think the voters would most likely support? Personally, again, going back to Shane's question, the transit item is critical. We want to maintain the same level of supporting transit, so I would not touch the transit item. So that's bare bones, is keep transit at 510.
All right, one question. I noticed that this spreadsheet does not reflect everything that Mike submitted last time in the reduction of scopes.
So again, the reduction of scope and the cost is reflected for all the projects in there. And if you look at up to number 9, all the projects up to number 9 ranking are within budget. Anything after number 9 is not within budget.
Okay, but I mean, what if we change something? I mean, because Mike cut slash pretty hard.
Yeah.
What if we put that in? How does that?
You mean like?
I mean, right now, our delta is 185 million from,
No, that's reflected in here, and it's in your packet too. So the spreadsheet you have in your packet shows that's a zero balance proposal.
no, because I mean, in here, he said he's willing to get rid of, reduce funding on the Drexel Bridge project. So
Okay,
that's
move
not
it-
showing in there.
Move it up. Let's double check which project.
Drexel, what number is that? For instance.
Yeah, let's double check, make sure it's reflected correctly.
Mike,
Yeah.
are you able to see any of these documents? Does that reflect the changes proposed by the city?
Yeah, you might be a better one to answer
you.
this. Thanks. Because it's not adding
Well,
up.
let's
in my
double
mind.
check. There it is, right, purple. Purple. So $2.5 million of RTA funds, that was the revised number, and 17 non-RTA.
I'm sorry, when I go deeper, like to 3665, 3666,
Double check.
I think he was gonna rescope all these to like 12.9 million,
Yeah. the changes- the
3658.
Changes are there, double check which ones.
3658 through 3672.
Yeah.
You moved down. on the
We've
list.
done our best, so let's double check, make sure it's correct.
Is there, Mike?
Oh,
Yeah, so thanks.
oh, so they are.
Here's really
There you
the
go,
bottom
page seven.
line, and I think the
Okay.
proposal that we put on the table outlined basically three concepts, three issues. The first was a reduction in the scope, which may or may not be in here. I haven't checked, but sounds like it might be. And those were literally our view of all of our projects to make sure that we could come up with we consider to be kind of bare bones. So that was the first time. The big ticket there was 22nd Street. It was about $96 million of pavement reconstruction we took out. We'll figure that out down the road another way. The second was a recommendation and a strong suggestion that we reduce the RTA Next contribution to SR 210. Not eliminate it, because I think it's important. I think it's important enough for us to have a conversation about the RMAP and ensure that somehow that project gets prioritized and put in that funding source. And the third thing, which is important, we went through and looked at projects that had opportunity for categorical element funding. And so all we did is we changed the scope, reduced the scope, and took those elements and put those into the categorical element funding, which we would have done anyway. You know, we just did it this way. I think that they need to be identified as a project in those categories. And that's what we did. And the way that what that comes to is $288 million. And that's what we put on the table. I don't understand the resistance to having a conversation around the RMAP funding. So I'm not following, but that's the recommendation. I also suggest that we have a similar conversation with the other, the interchange projects, you know, that we have in Marana. I think we should have a conversation. Those are regionally important projects, but there's other money coming to the region, and to use Rod's terminology, it's federal money. So we have to have a conversation around what does that look like and what component of that should be funded from RTA Next. And I think that brings all of those dollars to the table to solve the problem. So that was our suggestion. We came up with 288 million. And, you know, I thought the shortfall was around 300 million, as I recall, you know, from the conversation. So the shortfall should be less than 20 million.
Yeah.
That's basically what we did. Now, what I absolutely disagree with is moving dollars from the categorical elements to the corridor projects because they're named or identified. I disagree with that. I think those are functions, move the project element to the appropriate category. Okay, that's my opinion. And I recommend that very strongly. But does that answer your question, John and Jimmy?
So going back to Jamie's question, we are double checking and these are reflected, the dollar amounts are reflected, the scope is reflected.
They are. I keep getting screwed up between what's on the screen and what's on
So again,
my desk.
just a reminder, at the last meeting,
Yeah.
multiple people in this group said, integrate that into what we've done previously, see what the math does. The math does balance, it's zero, and that's what you have in your packet. And then in this version, what we're saying is, if you want to have a ranking order system to use in the future, you can add or subtract using this scenario. Yes, Carol.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to chime in that I agree totally with Mr. Ortega at our CAC meetings, and I think this has come up at the joint meeting as well before. We're struggling with the fact that there's not enough money, we feel, in the categoricals. And so, but we're also talking, like Tom said, about having named projects in the categoricals. So, you know, it's one thing to start naming modernization projects in the categoricals. I think that will be well received, but at the same time, also taking categorical money out and adding them to the named roadway projects is I don't think it's gonna go over very well at the CAC meeting, and I would like us to be kind of moving. We have been so far moving in the same direction. And Farhad, I thought that the RMAP was already being updated anyway, so I guess that's just a clarification.
So the RMAP update is separate, obviously, from the RTA exercise. We anticipate to have that updated hopefully within the next 2 years. And that's the challenge that Rod mentioned earlier. You know, you continuously have to update RMAP, and any decisions that are made in the RTA next would have to be updated in the RMAP as well. If I may, I want to go back to what Shane said earlier too. So we have not received any request from anybody on categorical named projects. So that's the next challenge. If anybody was going to submit named projects for categoricals, we have not on that process.
Mr. Chair, so what staff has presented here is a recommended path forward that takes into consideration some of the scope work that the city brought forward at our last meeting. It leaves intact the RMAP discussion so that it can follow its natural course of process and amending whatever that timeline is. It sounds like it needs to be sooner than later. And it also, with the exception of the high capacity transit project, it leaves intact the categorical buckets for the most part for us to wrestle with after we finish this part of our discussion.
Correct. And the decision point based on what Tom said is really, do you want to move any money from categoricals to fund corridor projects?
No, I agree with Mike, and I'll just say this just one more time. I agree that I don't know if we need to be necessarily moving money from bucket into the corridor as much as I think the priority is the greatest extent possible. We need to be naming specific projects within the categorical buckets because we've got corridor projects that are truly corridor projects. We've got safety projects that are truly safety projects. And I think we just color those projects with, different color of money. I think, but we should name as much as we can because ultimately this is an exercise of public trust, and the public's going to be far more inclined to vote for a named project as opposed to voting for this nebulous concept.
And it goes back to what Jeanette said earlier, that we have not gone and asked anybody to name any projects beyond corridors. So that's something to consider and discuss. And I think Paul touched on that as well. I think Terry and then Mike and Terry, we choose.
So I guess I'm still not clear on why there's still roughly nine projects. Eight projects that aren't funded. If the city came with 288 million and we were 300 million short, it seemed like that would leave us 12 million short, and most of these would be funded and included.
So the only difference in this scenario is the SR 210. If you remove funding from SR 210, then yes, that's one solution. Or if you remove funding from the buckets, that's another solution. So those are the decision points.
Okay, so this includes SR 210
Correct.
completely funded.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, so that's what I was missing.
Yes, those are the two decision points. Do you want to remove money from SR 210 or from the bucket?
This leaves the RMAP untouched.
Yeah.
And
Yes, Mike, I'm sorry.
So you said that no one has submitted any identified projects for the
Any of the
categorical elements. That
categories.
is not accurate because last meeting, that is exactly what I did.
Yes.
I submitted.
Nobody else.
No, that is exactly what I did. You said nobody has. So I want to make sure we're clear. That was the thought, to go through the analysis of the scope and identify components that we could put into the categorical elements. And I did that. I did that because that's something you all were going to do. Didn't do that. So I did it. for the city projects. And so those dollars, which was in that spreadsheet, were identified projects in those categories, not moving those monies into the corridor element.
So what, how does this, Farhad, how does this spreadsheet reflect that? Where you're taking
The spreadsheet.
scoping and you're putting appropriate monies in their appropriate categories or subcategories.
So it goes back to what we started talking about at the beginning of the meeting. If it's a corridor project, it's a corridor project. Where the money comes from, yet to be decided, right? So you all submitted corridor projects. City of Tucson submitted corridor projects.
Corridor projects come from that 1.2 or 1.1 billion.
That's what the board directed us to do, but if, that's what I'm saying, if you wish to go over that, you could, but the money has to come from somewhere. Where does the money come from?
Did you take that and?
Yeah.
So there are named projects in the categoricals with this.
Not
Yeah,
yet.
we haven't, not yet. We're still in buckets. So the buckets you see on the bottom highlighted, safety, environment, transit, administrative, those are buckets. If you wish to name under those buckets, we can do that. But for now, that's what we talked about earlier. If it's a corridor, it's a corridor.
So the reductions in scope for corridor that were put on the table by the city last meeting are reflected here,
All of them except
The exception
SR
of
210.
right? But what's unanswered is with the reduced in scope on these projects, there still is an unanswered question in terms of funding that we would have to jump into in the discussions for the categorical.
Exactly.
Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So per the recommendation of the city, if we were to reduce the SR 210 to 10% funding, that would free up 148 million. So
Those are the two decision points. Remove the money from SR 210 or remove it from categories.
so-
Yeah.
Or isn't there actually and I'm sorry, but isn't there also a third option, and that is move the projects into the categoricals?
Elements.
Yeah, elements of the projects into the categoricals.
I think at the end of the day, we're talking about the same pie. So how you cut up the pie, that's up to you. Yes, Paul.
Just a quick question. On the deferred line, the 230, is that the rollover of the current RTA?
Correct. Those are the current 4 projects that are being rolled over. Mike.
Just very simply, when I look at it and I look at what the city put forward, I believe there were 16 projects. It appears that the city has 8. Right, so is the difference 210? That we would fund additional city project? No, so it didn't really accommodate the scope changes.
No, this actually adds another project. So you do get up to number 9 project. The projects that you see highlighted in light orange, those are the ones right now that you can either fund using money from categories or you can fund using money from SR 210.
What I thought was that the city had put in a proposal that had a variety of scope changes, modifications
Yep.
that allowed for the funding of, I think there were 16 projects. And then I heard that the city's scope changes were in here, but it doesn't have, apparently not in its entirety.
No, it's there. It's a question of where's the money going to come from? Does it come from SR 210 or does it come from the buckets? That's it. And that's a recommendation we're looking forward to have.
So it's an up, down on 210.
Yeah, either 210 or buckets. That's really the only solution you have. And I'm going back to Terry's comment, and then you can shift the size of the pie anywhere you like, but we're trying to adjust the size of the pie. To adjust the size of the pie, that change needs to be made.
Mr. Chair, the only caveat to what you just said in terms of options. The city proposed some scope reduction to be funded through categoricals. So we don't have 100% of the categoricals at our discretion under this model because some of that is tied up under the recommendation that the city put forward last week.
No.
It's reflected in here and the change is only 15 million. That's the change between 90 and 85. That's the only difference.
Oh,
So that adjustment can be made again as,
oh, I see. Okay.
yeah, that adjustment can be made. Really, and I hope you all kind of can step back and look at it, that you can adjust those numbers. All we're saying is, let's adjust the size of the pie. And to do that, the money has to come from either buckets or from projects.
Okay.
Go ahead, Rod, Jan, then Mike.
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of put this out a little bit. So the city put forth this proposal.
Yep.
So I think ADOT's thoughts and opinions on this, we're in favor of RTA Next moving forward. And since the city put this proposal together and their thought is reducing, not eliminating, but reducing the funding of SR 210, but still keeping it in the program, I think that's something ADOT could support because we believe
There you
it's a
go.
vital
There you
component in moving forward. And if it's something that the city desires, I think ADOT can stand behind it. I just wanted to put that out there.
Jan?
Well, and I was just wondering, is it just 210, or do we look at some of the funding of those ADOT projects? I mean, with all due respect, do we look at Cortero or Tangerine 210, or is it just 210?
Thank you. That's the discussion I've been waiting for like 6 months. Yeah, it's that whole funding pot that we have to be, make a decision regionally on what's vital and what's important and what we want to move forward. And I think the city's made a valiant step. And I think the department is in favor of making more steps.
No, I was just gonna say, I think that's what I was waiting to hear is because SR 210 is, obviously very important to ADOT, but with the city making the recommendation, I think that kind of takes us a huge step forward, quite frankly. So that's, would we decide 150 million or 140 million towards 114? Okay. So yeah, I would be fine with, if they're fine with, putting SR 210 out there as a way to move us a little bit further down the track here. It doesn't get us 100% of the way there, but then we can identify within the category, but within the corridor projects, the elements in those corridor projects that fit into the categoricals to hopefully make up the difference. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, that's a hybrid of take some from 210, take some from categories. Obviously, yes, you have that option.
I'm gonna.
I think we should not
goes
be
next.
taking money from the category.
No.
We would be eligible.
Yeah, no.
We're moving out of
Yeah, so slice the pie differently. Okay.
Farhad, I think the nomenclature is important. I really do. I mean, we all have councils that we're listening to, and we're listening to them very carefully. And I think it's important when you're hearing from the rest of this group that saying it one way is problematic. We need to be responsive to that. I really believe that. So my only consternation in utilizing SR 210 is the unknown. I don't know what projects then in the RMAP, get second tier consideration. I've just not been part of that prioritization or that exercise. So it's easy for me to right now say, hey, this is great, but I don't know what that means in terms of, and how do you treat it? Is SR 210 now the absolute highest priority in the RMAP exercise and something else gets sacrificed? It's almost like a whole nother, it's a whole nother, which is okay. I just want the group to realize that what we're recommending here is that type of experiment. So, and it could be okay. I just haven't been part of that process. So I don't know.
So just for your benefit and everybody else's benefit, once it's approved by the voters, and that's how we operate it with the current RTA, then correct, that becomes the highest priority for ADOT funded projects. Yes.
Billy's point, and Farhad, feel free to adjust it. I mean, the RMAP is going to be revisited by PAG and the region is going to be approved through it. So the same board process, it's going to go through. So you're going to have an opportunity as members on PAG to look at that and reevaluate it when it goes through that process. So there will be an opportunity to reevaluate the priorities.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I make a recommendation to, per, ADOT's, somewhat approval to reduce, the SR 210 to 10% of what's shown on the spreadsheets, and then start from there, and I mean, at least that's a start.
25, 10% or 25 million?
Well, it's, what is it, 100 million on one, on 3550 is 100 mil. And then, what is it, 3552 is 64 mil. That's the total 165, that would reduce it to 16.5 for those two projects. And then
That's
that frees up
huge.
148 million. Is that
50
correct?
million. It's 50 million was our recommendation. That's
Yeah, the
what
city of
we-
Tucson's was 25 million each project.
That was
Oh,
just,
okay.
that was just allocated to us.
Oh.
I just did the math.
All right.
But my recommendation was the RTA match would be 50 million.
Yeah.
So it's a reduction of 114 million, because the
Okay.
total was 165 million of the
Oh.
RTA.
50 million for all of the SR 210 projects.
Correct.
25 mil each project.
Oh,
I think it's 25 each, but
all right.
so that, but it was the 165 would be reduced to 50. is my recommendation.
Is that your recommendation?
Is that your motion?
Revised.
Is that your motion?
Yes. Please.
So that doesn't get us, that doesn't take care of 100% of the
No.
Right, it's a
shortfall.
start.
But it's a
It
start.
gets us a lot closer, and I'm okay with that. And I think, I think what that means though is that some of those projects need to be considered some other way through the categoricals. And I think we just reserve that conversation to when we open up the whole categorical discussion and we pit that up against every, all the other demands for those monies, so that we can have that comprehensive discussion. With that understanding, I'll second that recommendation.
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, we'll adjust the RTA contribution on both SR 210 projects to $25 million each, and Jeanette is doing that as we speak. And whatever adjustments are needed to be made after that, we can have that conversation at future meetings and
It'll be a holistic conversation on the bucket stuff.
Friendly amendment to that, can we put the 4.5 million back in the categorical
What,
that we stole?
from what?
I just want to make a comment.
we can.
I'm not sure where that is even in here, because I've not suggested in my recommendation taking any money from categorical.
Yeah, exactly. I want to
So,
put it back whole.
yeah, but I haven't, all I had suggested was the component parts of the identified
Yeah.
projects that fit in the categories be put there.
Yeah.
How is it not whole? I'm not understanding.
Yeah,
I want to restore it to 90 million because with Farheads, with this version, they reduced it by
Yeah,
4.5
we can do
million.
that. So Jeanette, go ahead and plug that in so that on the gray area, so now you see the difference, make that 90 again. Go.
So we've
There you
restored
go.
that.
So
Restored the category.
basically what that shows is
We have 100.
$111 million are left to go towards other named projects or other corridor projects.
Which can include the ones listed here,
Correct.
or like Mike talked about, the 70 million for transit, high capacity transit.
That's a discussion that Shane added to the conversation to talk about the elements. Once you know what's left on the table. So there's 111 left on the table now to program.
Wouldn't that 111 be prioritized on the modernization projects?
Yes,
Then-
after you fund those projects.
The delta would then be,
Go ahead.
would be a deficit that could be considered holistically with all the other discussion points for the categorical.
Yes, Jeanette, if you don't mind, go up into the green column and zero those out in order from top to bottom.
All
Yeah,
of these,
zero, yeah, well, from top to bottom in order until you hit 111.
111 million. or close to
Zero
that.
that out, zero that out.
Shane, just looking at the math, if the shortfall is
One more.
300 million and you came up with 288,
One more.
it's a $12 million shortfall, right?
Well, this will show you right here.
The simple math. The only thing that we hadn't done based on the recommendation then is allocate 36 million to the categorical. So if you take 12 million plus 36 million, you know, that's 40, and that could be the shortfall.
There you go. This shows you,
Everything was included in terms of the scope changes.
That you guys.
The shortfall, now that the motion is on the table, which hasn't been voted on, the shortfall should be 48 million bucks.
Yeah, and
Based
that's-
on 300.
and that's what this shows you. You got the remaining 4 projects in red are the ones that are not currently funded.
Yeah.
Yep. So they follow that? So 15 million plus 8.7 plus 7 plus 11, those are the ones that are not currently funded.
there's 3,000 left, but if we zero out any of those, we're gonna be over, so.
So we're, again, this is consistent with your motion. SR 210 will get you down to this. Your second, I'm sorry. All right, so everybody follows where we're at. So only 4 projects that are currently corridor projects still would be remaining for discussion. Elements, categorical elements have not been touched. That's consistent with the motion and the second, right? Any discussions on that?
I keep coming back to, I made a recommendation to have components of some of the identified projects in the corridors identified in the categoricals.
I think that was consistent with the suggested motion.
But then that number isn't accurate. So where?
Not yet.
Not yet, that's the motion.
Well, because we haven't identified exactly what from the named projects, from the corridor projects would go over into, from a categorical standpoint, what would go into the categorical. So we have to identify what fits and what those numbers equal up to.
Okay, so I've given you a recommendation of $36 million in projects that are in cities. Are you thinking you're gonna do more than that? Because I already put those out there on the table last time. And that was $36 million. So if there's an interest in doing more, then, I mean, I've done all I can do on my end.
Yeah.
Then you all need to go back and look at that. You know, because I've made that recommendation, which is not to move dollars from the category, because I need those elements to them.
Into the category.
So could it
So
be,
does that take the 45 million or whatever it was,
Should bring it down to about 12.
about 12?
Should.
so could a friendly amendment then to the friendly amendment
We're very friendly to
to incorporate, in addition to what we proposed, the 36 million that you had recommended, those elements
Identify
part of that
projects.
discussion, that we do this with the understanding of that 36 million that might give us a little more leeway, but that those will then come back in the next iteration where we see how elements would be incorporated in the categories.
So just to be clear, to the maker of the motion and the second. The 4 projects you see are the 4 projects based on the discussion that would benefit from that $38 million. Is that what you're suggesting?
So again, we're getting hung up on those 4 projects. And if you remember,
Those
we went
specific-
through all of the projects. And I made a recommendation on the specific projects. I gave a list. So these projects would fit in those categorical elements because they were safety projects or they were active transportation. So I don't think it's just as simple as saying the 36 million, you know, goes to
Covers the
these.
bottom.
I think you have to look at the scope of those projects. Because it's not, you don't just put those in. I think it has to be looked at in terms of the scope so that they fit within the elements. And I can read them for you. if you like.
So that's what goes back to what Shane and Terry are saying, to be determined, correct?
Determine it right now.
Farhad, if I can ask, would it be cleaner to separate these motions? So take an action on the 210 question?
Yeah.
It seems like that is.
That would be helpful. Are you willing to do that? All right, so if you're willing to do that, the motion as we understand it would be to adjust RTA's contribution to $25 million each on the two SR 210 projects. And then that's it, period. Maker is okay, second is okay. All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion on the SR 210? If not, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so that motion passes. Thank you for the suggestion. So now the remaining of the discussion is, what do you want to do with that savings from SR 210 adjustment? And I go back to what Shane discussed, that we can fund as many projects as we can from the current corridor projects. And the balance to do that was roughly $38 million.
What I hear from Mike, based off of his recommendation, is these numbers are not reflective of the scope change.
They are. Let's go over them there. They are. We can double check.
Okay, then if that's the
Reflective
case,
of the scope change, what they're not reflective of is moving things into the category.
right, but we still should be okay then. Because if those numbers are correct, then we can truly just apply the new resource after moving SR 210 out. A portion of SR 210 out. That we can now apply that new resource to additional modernization projects, knowing that we still have an exercise ahead of us of now appropriately allocating those scope changes into the categoricals. If I'm understanding it correctly. So it looks like, wait, is this a different sheet?
No, this is the same one. So you again, based on what we're showing, if you add up those four projects, I think you're roughly 38 million, right?
38.5
Yeah,
million,
38.5 is
That's Mike's 38.
what is needed to fund all the named projects. That's it. And so the question becomes, how do you want to handle that 38.5?
I gave a recommendation. Who's those categories? Well, I don't know. Those. I gave a list of projects to each board. I gotta go.
All right, looks like we're gonna lose our quorum, but so
Sam can come up.
well, okay, that's fine. If you're here, that's great. All right, let's pause until we switch seats. All right, so we still have a quorum. That's good. Sorry. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Are you joining us at the table? Or you're leaving? You're leaving. So let's check on quorum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We still have a quorum. That's good. Okay, so again, just for everybody's benefit, 38.5 currently is what we talked about being over budget. And by over budget, I mean over $1.1 billion. Our suggestion is to just use that $38 million from another category and balance, and you can fund all the projects. That's staff recommendation. What Mike is suggesting is to move the projects from categories. So you have both options. It's 38.5 total. That's really the topic of discussion at this point. If you remove 38.5 from those elements, you fully fund all named projects.
I really don't, I know that there's a lot of sensitivity on moving money from the category. There's already sensitivity that there's not enough money in categoricals.
Yeah.
So I'd rather not move money from categoricals. I'd rather find out where it makes most sense to take these projects and appropriately put them into a categorical. Is that possible?
Move our 3 million to it.
So I go back to the conversation we had earlier that do you want to have, let's talk about safety. Well, intersections, that's probably the easiest one, right? Under safety, you have an intersection element. Under an intersection element, you can have 5 intersections. Or any of those intersection projects. And if that's the case, are you reducing the scope to just intersections? And that's the challenge. The scope of these projects are not just the spot improvement, they are corridor improvements.
But there's elements of that would fall in.
So that's what I'm saying. How do you want to skin the cat, right? You want to break him down to elements, or you want to keep it as a corridor?
I get it.
Yeah, if I could add, Shane, I think I understand your question. I'm looking back at what we presented last meeting 2 weeks ago. There are 2 projects specifically, La Cholla Boulevard, Star Pass Boulevard to Ajo Way Modernized Corridor. We had 7.6 million in safety and 3.4 million in active modes. And then for 22nd Street, Alvernon to Camino Seco, which used to be a $96 million project, we've broken that down into 17 million safety and 10.5 active modes. And that totals the 38.5 million.
Yeah, there you go. You're there. So if we have a motion to do that.
Then that's the 38.5 million. But they're not corridor projects per se anymore. They are
That's right.
elements.
That's right. It's now shifted from corridor into
An
element.
And our recommendation would be that they are named
Yes.
under the categorical elements.
Amen, brother.
Yep. I'll put that in the form of motion.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second, just to be clear. It would be 2 projects, each divided up by dollar amounts under elements of safety and active transportation. And those are La Cholla and what's the other project?
22nd Street,
22nd Street.
projects 3664 and 3656. And I have a spreadsheet that I'm happy to send to you.
Everybody follows that. All right. Any other discussion on that one? If not, all those in favor?
I
Opposed? All right, so that balances the name project list as well as, I'm sorry, the corridor project list. Yes,
All right, now the genie's out of the bottle where we're naming projects in the categorical. Should we have some governance on that? Like, because obviously we can't
so
100% name them. Should we
I-
kind of create a rule that says we'll have no more than 30%? Kind of going back to what Tom was talking in the beginning. No
So
more than
that's-
30% of category
That's
to be
where we
named.
started the conversation from.
Because we need flexibility, but we need transparency, right? So-
Yes, so ideally, that'll be a policy decision by the board at some point to differentiate between what is identified under each category and what to do with the balance that's not identified.
Could we make this a rule for TMC and CAC? Because everybody's gonna start lining up for.
Well, and I've had conversations with other members that, you know, they've asked that, well, can they add projects under elements? So that's a policy discussion as well, so.
Somehow we're gonna need to name projects. And I understand the need for flexibility, but I gotta just say, I mean, the more projects we can name in these buckets, I think the more successful we're gonna be. We've got, you know, I think there's an element of flexibility there. We've got the 100 million in contingency that's still sitting on the table. We need that kind of flexibility, but the more we can name, I think the more successful we're gonna be.
Nobody knows what costs are gonna be in the next
I
20
know.
years, though.
I
I
know.
think that's where we set ourselves up for failure, because right now there's already, 2 projects that
Well,
have been
think about this.
prioritized to RTA next. So we have to find that balance point. I don't know what it is.
But I think that whoever's sitting in our seats 15 years from now, if there's a need to prioritize, it's gonna be a lot easier prioritizing named projects if we
Yeah.
know what they are than to prioritize the unknown. And so I think we can go through a similar exercise in the future, even if 100% of those monies are named. you know, we can go through a prioritization exercise. So I don't know, there's the balance.
Get Paul down there first, then Sam.
I was gonna say, we create flexibility if we can divorce 12.6 from RTA. And that's a lot of money. That's 400 million over 20 years. That creates that flexibility. That's what at least we see in our region, is that right now there is no flexibility because that money's been sucked into the RTA to make the RTA whole, the present RTA. Once the present RTA ends, then we can have RTA funding, which is named, to add that assurity to the voters of named projects. And we still have the open 12.6 that we can work on as a region. Then we create that flexibility, because there's no way that we can tell what's going to be needed 25 years from now, you know, in totality. We're looking at the major corridors, but we still need to have that flexibility. But that's where the 12.6 comes in. That gives that flexibility, at least in my opinion.
Okay, Sam.
Shane, to your point about then having projects listed on the categoricals, you remember, we started with a really long list of projects that we sort of whittled down. There might be an opportunity to go back and look at some of those projects and say, elements of those projects fit into the categorical. Maybe that, now that we've balanced the roadway element, start that exercise.
I know we start, what was it, 108 projects or whatever? I mean, I think that would be a good place to go as we try to prioritize the category. So a lot of us took projects off because we thought some element of it was going to be manifest in
Might be an
the
opportunity to go back and
subcategories.
look at some of those projects, say,
Yeah.
elements of those projects fit into the categorical.
Somebody
Maybe
don't
that,
like
now that
that.
we've balanced the roadway.
All right, if there's nothing else that's helpful, again, just so you all understand the process, the CAC is still looking at these, but these would be forwarded to the CAC as a path forward, and hopefully Terry and Carmine can explain to the CAC members the thought process and help them move forward as well.
Is the CDC supposed to meet this week?
They
Yeah,
were supposed to meet
we can have
yesterday, they
quorum.
did not have a quorum.
Is that like a holiday thing, travel stuff, Memorial Day? Is that what we were
Yeah,
doing?
we hope that was the reason for it, so we'll try again next Monday. Sam,
Just for clarification, what is it that will be forwarded to the CAC?
the two motions that were acted on,
How will that be reflected to them?
the two motions exactly as they
Another
were acted on.
spreadsheet that reflects all that.
We can do a spreadsheet, or we can just tell them, here's what the motion was that passed. So, but yeah, the spreadsheet would
I think a visual was.
zero it out, just like as we discussed, yeah.
I think the CEC still don't have a problem with that 70 million high capacity transit issue. So,
So that'll be another discussion point.
because that gets brought up a lot.
And I think Tom is gone by now, but again, I think.
I'm back.
All right,
Yeah.
so Tom, we're just talking about the CAC meeting Monday, and we'll reflect what was discussed today. And we'll need your help and Terry's help and Carmine and Caroline's help to explain to everybody what the thought process is. All right, anything else? Questions, comments, suggestions?
I just wanted to say one more thing. The city had approached me, or I had approached them initially to let them know that why we had left some of their projects under the name project list, because my understanding was there was legal ramifications for that. But it sounds like after today's discussion, we're able to move that into categorical. So I just want to make sure that's clear, because that's something we've been telling the CAC, is that
Yes.
all projects that are identified, need to be identified, that must be under named projects. So I
Well,
just want to
here's,
make sure there's not confusion.
okay, one of the reasons why I believe Jan was asking some questions on the nomenclature was because I believe that named projects could be in any category of funding. It could be in the corridor funding, it could be in the safety funding, it could be in the transit funding. And so I think I'm hoping that we're creating part of the complication and confusion, saying named projects are only just the corridor projects. But I think if we have a different color of money for each bucket, whether it's a corridor or safety or a transit, then we can name projects in each of those buckets of money. And so.
Yeah, I think we're all saying the same thing, that at the end of the day, what is the intent? The intent is for the public to understand where that money is going to be spent. So if we define and name the project, whether it's a corridor or a category, that's the intent.
Yes, okay.
All right, everybody else, any questions, comments? Thank you all. Appreciate your involvement. Again, this is difficult stuff, but thank you for doing it.
Oh, yeah. It's only 2 hours. No, I'm good. I'm good. I still got